Last time I was here, we started in on this second question. How did we get here? And that presentation was on cultural dominance. Why it was that some societies, most frequently Eurasian ones, were able to become so much more innovative and powerful than other ones. Today I'd like to continue that conversation with the ships that ended the isolation, human isolation that was caused by geography, and then to focus specifically on Western Europe and the migrations that were going on there that would eventually determine human settlement. 15,000 years ago, all the continents were occupied with the exception of Antarctica, and all the world's people were at about the same level of cultural development. All were at about the same level of cultural sophistication. And then innovations in technology, the domestication of plants and animals, and particularly position on the globe determined or caused some of them to develop disproportionately. But still, for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years, they still all remained isolated until the advent of ships. It started in the Eastern Mediterranean with the Egyptians and the Minoans and the Greeks. And then it spread to the Indian Ocean with the Arabs and the Asiatic peoples, all expanding trade routes. And then the Polynesians pushed out into the South Pacific, exploring in their big double-hulled sailing canoes. And then the Vikings exploded out of Scandinavia in their fearsome tall ships. And then the Chinese in their great treasure ships, followed just a short time after that by Columbus, who arrived in the New World in 1492. And within just a few hundred years, that isolation that I talked about had ended. So let's take a look at those ships in a little more detail. People were venturing out onto the water long before the advent of the first ships. These watercraft were very simple. They were skins stretched on a bone or wooden frames. They were rafts made out of reeds or bundles of wood lashed together. Or they were dug out, they were tree trunks that had been dug out into canoes. These early vessels really weren't suitable for anything but the calmest of waters, ponds, small lakes, estuaries, although it's thought that it was craft like these that brought the first Aborigine to Australia about 50,000 years ago. Now, of course, you all know of the biblical stories of Noah, who was said to have constructed much larger craft of much more sophisticated design about 6,000 years ago. But the first ships capable of voyaging any distances appeared in the 3rd millennium BC, about 5,000 years ago, in early Egypt and among the Minoans, who established a thriving civilization on the island of Crete. And you see it in their art, their murals and and other forms of art. About 1,000 years later, in the 2nd millennium, you find similar ships in the art of the Mycenaean Greeks. And these are the folks that of Homer's Iliad and Helen of Troy. Now, all of these are relatively simple craft, and they were all used with the idea of expanding trade. And they're simple in the sense that they were principally powered by oars or by rowing. And if they had sails at all, they were very rudimentary square sails. The greatest of all the Mediterranean sea peoples were the Phoenicians, who did the most to expand trading routes throughout that area. Everywhere they went, they established trading ports, seaports, that sort of thing. Perhaps their best known one was the city of Carthage. Now remember, this represents about 2,500 years of ship development. But just to kind of give you an example of what their ships were capable of, that famous Phoenician commander Hannibal, in 218 BC was able to ferry a whole army together with 36 war elephants across the Mediterranean to the shores of Spain, which was then called Iberia. He marched that army and those elephants over the Alps down into Italy, where he sacked Rome. Also note that The Phoenicians never sailed anywhere outside of the Mediterranean except for a little ways into Western Europe. And this is because their ships just simply couldn't handle open ocean travel. Their hulls lacked the structural integrity, their sails were relatively rudimentary, and they used a side-mounted steering oar, instead of a rear-mounted rudder, which was very ungainly when the swells picked up and that steering oar kept coming out of the water. Their ships were called galleys, and they were used principally in trading, so that a priority was put on capacity, cargo capacity, and a reduction as much as possible in labor. But the Phoenicians were also responsible for significant advances in warships. They developed the bireme, which was 2 decks, one on top of the other with 2 sets of rowers. Later on, these would be superseded by the Greek trireme, that's 3 decks with 3 sets of rowers, and these ships dominated the seas of their time. Beginning about 4,000 years ago, Arab traders began linking up with their counterparts in the Mediterranean. Their ship of choice was called a dhow, basically a simple shell outfitted with a lateen sail. Dhows were the first stitch and glue vessels. This is where you have sawn planks and they're put end to end or side to side with pitch or tar or glue between them, and then they're literally stitched together with rope or thread. Dhows also had a lateen sail. This is a sail that ran fore and aft on the ship and allowed them to sail into the wind, not always against it. Now, dhows are still used today. They're used in the Mediterranean, they're used in the Indian Ocean, but most modern sailing craft have adopted a different kind of fore and aft sail design, as shown here in the schooner Martha, made possible by modern materials and designs. Now, these were coastal sailors. They were moving in and out of the Persian Gulf, they were moving in and out of the Red Sea. They descended down along the coast of Africa and then up around into India, linking up with their Asian counterparts who were coming out of ports around major rivers like the Ganges or the Yangtze. In the beginning, these ships were used primarily in the coastal trade, seldom venturing outside of land. But sometime around in the 1st century, Arab traders learned how to use the monsoon winds. They could kick off from the shores of Arabia or Africa, called Aden at that time, and set sail into the Indian Ocean. And by following the gentle monsoons, they would end up on the coast of India. This would be in the summertime. And then in the wintertime, they could pick up the offshore breezes and they could sail back again. And as long as we're talking about ships, we should also include the ships of the desert. Camels, along with horses and mules and other beasts of burden, were developing overland routes that were linking up inland areas with the seaports at the same time that all of these other seaborne trading routes were going on. The Polynesians were the first true seagoing people, venturing far out into the open ocean with their double-hulled sailing canoes. And this was about the same time as the Phoenician expansion was going on in the Mediterranean, about 3,200 years ago. Research has shown that these peoples originated in Taiwan and then descended into the Philippines, Indonesia, and then out into the islands of the South Pacific. They reached their furthest extent north, which was Hawaii, their furthest extent east, which was Easter Island, and their furthest extent south, which was New Zealand, about 1,500 years ago. So really not that long ago. These drawings are of Hawaiian war canoes made by an artist that was traveling with Captain Cook in 1779. There's very little record of what their voyaging canoes looked like, although this is what it's thought they were. Double hulls with the idea of 2 of these canoes that were lashed together with an overlying deck, and then 2 of these unusual triangular sails. It was often thought, too, that these would travel together, 3 or 4 of them together in their voyages. The navigational abilities of these Polynesians was legendary, since none of them had any knowledge of the compass. They used a variety of techniques, and one that has come down to us is these stick charts, which are thought to represent maps to islands depicted by the shells, and then the different sticks represent currents or winds or possible routes to these islands. Vikings charged out of Scandinavia in the year 750 and dominated the region for about the next 400 years. Their ships, their long ships, were of a new design called lapstrake or clinker built, which I'll explain in just a minute. And this design allowed them to venture into the into the really fearsome North Atlantic waters. Vikings went westward. They landed in Greenland, Iceland, and North America. They never established a colony in North America, and their colony in Greenland would eventually collapse. But they also went south. They went south on raiding parties into Ireland, into England, and Western Europe. They started out as kind of raiders and enslavers looking for booty and treasure. Eventually, they would settle in, adapt to the customs of the local population, and evolve into a trading lifestyle. Vikings, for example, are given credit, this is a map of Ireland, are given credit for having established the cities of Dublin, Cork, Wexford, and Limerick, as well as other cities throughout England and Western Europe. At least one Viking voyage was known to have penetrated the Straits of Gibraltar and made it all the way to Egypt. But perhaps the Vikings' greatest legacy were the voyages that they made into the rivers of northern Russia. They descended up those rivers, over the passes, and down the other side. And in the course of doing all this, they linked together the various Slavic tribes in the region into a vast trading network. And that unification is given credit for establishing what would become the nation of Russia. Rus actually was the name that those Slavic tribes gave to their Russian trading partners. Beginning in about the 10th century, the Chinese began sending out fleets to trade with the islands of Southeast Asia. Their principal port was in Nanjing. You can see from this map that their routes not only extended into Southeast Asia, but also westward to India, as well as to the shores of Africa. Culminating in the early part of the 15th century, about 400 years later, the Chinese sent out huge treasure fleets consisting of 200 to 400 vessels, and some of them as big or as long as a football field with 4 decks, 9 masts. And it's almost impossible to conceive that ships of this magnitude, of this sophistication, could have been built and designed in that period of time, especially since so few artifacts have remained, and there's very little in the historic record. But every once in a while, something does turn up. This tiller was dug up when a shipyard was being built in Nanjing in 1957. This tiller is 35 feet long. Now, some of you may have read 1421, Gavin Menzies' book on Chinese explorations. He claims that Xinghi, who was the most famous of these Chinese treasure ship admirals, and also was a eunuch, by the way, as were all of the Chinese admirals, for a reason that escapes history. Maybe we should try it, though. Menzies claims that Xinghi and his fellow admirals circumnavigated the globe and explored both coasts of North and South America. While he was gone, or while they were gone, the Emperor Zhu Di experienced a number of personal catastrophes, along with an earthquake that collapsed a good part of his palace. He felt that he had done something wrong, and the gods had turned against him. So he recalled the treasure fleets, and when they returned, he burned them, he sent the admirals into exile, and he destroyed all the records, which is why so little remains today. And I think about that, those of you who are history buffs. I can't think of anything in history that I know about that had such a turning point or created such a turning point as that earthquake. If that earthquake hadn't occurred and these ships had continued to develop in their design, it's very likely that the history of the world would be very different than it is today. And as we look around this room, the faces we see would have largely been Asiatic rather than of European extraction. Well, just 50 years after, or more than that, more like 70 years after these great Chinese treasure ships, Columbus landed in the Americas, in a little island off of Cuba, as is shown here in this diagram. Although Columbus's ships were still extraordinarily primitive by almost any standard, they incorporated a number of design features which made his trips at least survivable. This shows 2 of those significant design features. Both of these ships are of a caravel design, which was very popular throughout the Mediterranean. The one on the right is Carvel built. It's a little confusing. This is a caravel design, but carvel built, which means that the planks of the hull are, as I showed you before, end to end, side to side, separated by pitch or glue and stitched or pegged together. Very popular throughout the early shipping world, Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. This other design that you see here, called clinker built, shows planks or has planks that are overlapping one over top of the other. And this greatly increased the strength and the durability of the ship when it was on the open ocean. For example, there's an image of a Viking longship from the prow on, and you can see very clearly this clinker built, or what's called now lapstrake built design, which made their voyages possible. The other difference, or the other design change that you see, is the addition of square sails. By Columbus's time, the Mediterranean sailors had all adopted the lateen sails of the Arabian sailors. They were very common, used for ghosting in and out, small islands, light winds. But when you get on the open ocean and you have the trade winds behind you for long periods of time, the square sail is far more powerful. So Columbus's ships, they were all clinker built, and they all had a combination of lateen and square sails. If you add that together with the fact that they had adopted as a rear-mounted rudder, which came off the back of the ship rather than the old steering oars, and put that together with the durability and strength of rope and canvas that had evolved over the time, and Columbus's voyage, Columbus had a reasonable chance of success. So now moving forward, the ships of the 16th century, the large ocean-going ships, they were all square-rigged. They also had very high sides and very high decks in the bow and in the stern. This was because cannon had not come into common use at the time. So naval warfare consisted of Marines or soldiers who were firing back and forth at each other with small arms. So that the higher you got, the better your vantage point. But the problem is, if any of you are sailors, you know, the problem would be that makes these ships very ungainly and poor sailors and prone to rolling over. Perhaps the greatest of all of the ships of this design was the Vasa, built in 1628 by Sweden. It rolled over in its maiden voyage in Stockholm Harbor and killing about 50 people. Sweden has dredged up some of the remains of this ship and created a wonderful museum in Stockholm called the Vasa Museum, and if you're ever there, I encourage you to take a look. A major step forward was taken in the early part of the 18th century when a priority was put on streamlining, and these decks were cut down and changes were made to the hull and so forth. They also added foresails, which are these triangular sails that you see coming out on the bow of the ship. And this improved maneuverability and allowed these square-rigged ships to sail, at least to some extent, into the wind. And from here, it was one small step layered on one small step as the ships got bigger and bigger until the advent of the steam engine. And by that time, the inhabited world had been discovered and the isolation ended. I want to take kind of a tangent now. I'm going to come back to the ships in a little while, but right now I want to focus on migrations, human migrations that were going on in Europe as kind of a microcosm of what was going on in the rest of the world at this time. And to do that, I need to step back about 1.5 million years, going back a ways. At this point in time, it was when the human brain was beginning its major period of expansion. And there were 3 hominid species alive together in Africa. One of them was from the old Australopithecine group, and there were 2 from the Homo group. And almost as soon as this period begins, these 3